In the spring of 1889, a prison warden named Solomon Vetch retired from federal service after 22 years, moved into a rented room above a hardware store in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and began writing. He wrote for 4 years. He filled 11 composition notebooks with a cramped, methodical hand that his landlady, a widow named Frances Pruitt, would later describe as the handwriting of a man who had decided that speed no longer mattered, only accuracy. He did not write for publication. He did not write for family. He had no family remaining by then. He wrote by the account of the only person who ever read the notebooks in their entirety, because he had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally calculated that he had less time left to carry it than he had already spent carrying it. He had spent 6 of his 22 federal years as the supervising warden of a holding facility that does not appear in any official register of federal detention infrastructure for the period. Not in the Bureau of Prisons records, not in the Army Quartermaster records, not in the Department of the Interior's property inventories. A facility with a staff of 9, an operating budget drawn from a line item in the Federal Ledger described only as Western Survey Continuance, and a single long-term occupant. That occupant had arrived in the autumn of 1881. He had arrived from Moundsville, West Virginia. When Vetch finally finished writing and set down his pen, the first thing those notebooks established was that the occupant had never been charged with any crime. The second thing they established was that in 6 years of daily contact, Solomon Vetch had come to regard the occupant not as a subject, not as an acquisition, and not as an anomaly. He had come to regard him as the most intelligent person he had ever known. The official personnel record of Solomon Vetch at the Department of the Interior shows a federal employee who served from 1867 to 1889 in a series of supervisory roles across 3 Western Virginia counties. His file is thin, thinner than 22 years of service should produce. The assignments listed are vague in their descriptions. Facility oversight, survey continuance support, Western District coordination, the kind of language that fills space in a federal record without conveying information. His pension was approved without complication. His separation papers were signed by a mid-level interior official whose own record, when examined, shows no other personnel actions of any consequence during his entire tenure. It is the record of a man who was deliberately kept unremarkable on paper. Solomon Vetch was not unremarkable. He had served as a Union Army logistics officer during the Civil War, managing supply chains for 3 separate campaigns, with a reputation for precision that earned him 2 formal commendations. He had been recruited into federal civilian service in 1867 by a man whose name appears in Vetch's pension file as a reference, but nowhere else in any public record. A man listed only as G. Poole, Bureau Coordination. The same initial, the same surname, the same bureau that sent field teams into Roane County in 1877 and into Moundsville in 1881. Frances Pruitt, Vetch's landlady in Parkersburg, gave a brief account to a local historian in 1931. She was 78 years old at the time. She said Vetch had been a quiet man, regular in his habits, and that he had written every evening without exception until his death in 1893. She said he had asked her, in the last week of his life, to keep the notebooks safe until someone came asking the right questions. She said she had kept them for 11 years, and that in 1904 a man had come to her door asked for them by description without knowing their contents, and that she had given them over because he had known things about Solomon Vetch that she had not told anyone. She did not know the man's name. She said he had federal bearing and had arrived on a Wednesday and left on a Thursday, and that the notebooks had gone with him in a case that locked with a key he wore on a chain. The notebooks have not been located. Their existence is established by Francis Pruitt's 1931 account, by a reference in Vetch's own pension file to personal memoranda retained at separation, and by a single letter Vetch wrote in 1892 to a former Army colleague named Porter Gaines, a letter that Gaines kept that passed through his family and that a researcher found in a private collection in western Pennsylvania in 1987. In that letter, Vetch wrote enough to make the notebook's absence matter enormously. Before we go further, if you find these buried records as compelling as I do, hit subscribe so the next one reaches you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. Now, back to Solomon Vetch and what he learned in 6 years of daily contact with the man they had brought to him from Moundsville. To understand what Solomon Vetch was warden of, we have to go back, not just to 1881 and not just to West Virginia. We have to go back to the institutional logic that made a facility like his not only possible but necessary. By the late 1870s, the Bureau of Ethnology had accumulated enough field reports, enough collected material, and enough suppressed testimony from enough counties across enough states to understand that what it was dealing with was not a collection of isolated anomalies. The giant skeletal remains being pulled from mounds across the Ohio Valley were not the scattered remnants of occasional biological outliers. They represented, in the aggregate, a population, a people, one that had lived in the eastern half of North America in sufficient numbers to leave behind earthworks covering hundreds of square miles, burial complexes of staggering geometric precision, and trade networks stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. The official story, that these were the direct ancestors of contemporary Native American tribes, fully understood, fully catalogued, fully accounted for, was not a conclusion the Bureau had reached through evidence. It was a conclusion the Bureau had decided on first, and then arranged the evidence to support. Because the alternative conclusion, supported by the physical record, was one that no federal institution in 1879 was prepared to defend in public. The alternative conclusion was that there had been a separate and distinct people, large in stature, advanced in construction, and apparently present in North America long before any timeline the official history was willing to accommodate. A people whose descendants, or survivors, might not be entirely gone. The 1881 transfer from Moundsville, documented in August Renner's Pittsburgh lecture, corroborated by Cornelius Hatch's commission ledger, consistent with Justice Wicks's diary entries from Roane County, was not the Bureau's first such acquisition. Vetch's letter to Porter Gaines makes that clear. He wrote that when the occupant arrived at the facility, there was already infrastructure in place, already a protocol, already a set of procedures that someone had written down and someone else had trained him to follow. The facility was not built for this occupant. It had been waiting. What set the 1881 occupant apart from whatever had come before, and Vetch is careful in his letter not to describe what had come before, only to acknowledge that it existed, was that this one was willing to talk. The letter to Porter Gaines runs to 6 pages. It is not a confession. It is not a plea. It reads, in the account of the 1987 researcher who examined it, like a man performing a final inventory of what he knew, sorting it, labeling it, making sure that at least one other person in the world had a partial record, even if the full record was going to disappear. Vetch described the facility as a converted agricultural structure on federal land in a county he declined to name, modified with materials and at an expense inconsistent with any legitimate agricultural purpose. High ceilings, reinforced framing, a doorway he described as the first thing any visitor noticed, because it was built for someone who had not been consulted about the dimensions of standard doorways. Custom furniture, custom fixtures, a kitchen arrangement designed for quantities of food that Vetch said had struck him as implausible until the occupant arrived and he understood they were barely sufficient. The occupant's name, as he gave it to Vetch on the first day, was not recorded in the letter. Vetch referred to him throughout only as my charge. He wrote that the name, when spoken aloud, was not a name he could render accurately in English letters, and that after several attempts in the early weeks, he had asked permission to use a simpler form, and that the occupant had considered this for a long moment, and then said that names were not what mattered most, and that Vetch could use whatever he liked. What Vetch liked, he wrote, was to use no name at all, to simply speak as two men speak when formality has worn away and something more functional has replaced it. He described the occupant's English as precise and considered, not fluent in the way of a man who had grown up speaking it, but fluent in the way of a man who had studied it with serious intent and had decided which parts of it were worth mastering. He said the occupant read everything Vetch could bring him: newspapers, agricultural journals, congressional records, legal proceedings. He said the occupant read with a speed that Vetch found difficult to describe without sounding as though he were embellishing, and that after reading, he asked questions that suggested he had understood not just the content, but the implications behind the content. What a thing meant about the people who had written it, what it revealed about what they were afraid of, what it showed about the distance between what they said officially and what they understood privately. Vetch wrote that after approximately 8 months, he had stopped thinking of his role as custodial. That is the word he used. He wrote that he had begun to think of it as something closer to the role of a man who has been unexpectedly trusted with a correspondence he did not ask for, and does not entirely deserve. He wrote that the occupant had told him, in the 2nd year, that Vetch was the 14th person in what the occupant called the long patience, who had been worth speaking to honestly. He wrote that he had asked what the long patience was, and that the occupant had looked at him for a moment with an expression Vetch described as the expression of a man deciding how much of a long story to tell someone he is not certain will live to hear the end of it, and had then told him enough to make the question of whether to write it down the most serious decision of Vetch's life. He had decided to write it down. That was the 11 notebooks. Now consider what surrounds this account, because Vetch was not the only careful observer in that facility. A Bureau of Ethnology field physician named Walter Sohn was assigned to the facility for the duration of the occupant's detention, a fact established by a single payroll record in the National Archives that lists Sohn's compensation for the years 1882 through 1887 under the same Western Survey continuance line item as Vetch's own salary. Sohn died in 1901. His professional papers were donated by his widow to the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, where a portion of them remains in the historical collection. The portion that remains does not include his facility case notes, which his widow listed separately in the donation inventory as Western Assignment Medical Records, 7 volumes. Those 7 volumes are listed as received. They are not listed as currently held. The college's archivist, in response to a researcher's inquiry in 1996, noted that the volumes appeared to have been transferred to another institution at some point prior to 1940, and that the transfer documentation had not survived. What does survive in the Sohn papers is a single sheet, filed loose inside an unrelated folder of pharmaceutical correspondence, that appears to be a page from a summary document rather than the case notes themselves. It is written in a clinical hand and contains partial measurements. The page is not dated. It lists height, recorded at 2 points in time, with a notation that the second measurement was taken 3 years after the first and showed no change, which Sohn had underlined once. It lists bone density observations, described as consistent with earlier regional findings but exceeding previous maximum recorded values. And at the bottom of the page, in the same clinical hand, but written more slowly, as though the writer had paused before committing to it, is a single line that reads, "Subject demonstrates retention of knowledge inconsistent with individual lifespan. Source of retention unclear. Further documentation in Volume 4. Volume 4 is among the missing 7. Consider now the pattern of what accumulates. Kanawha County, West Virginia, 1880. A county physician named Reeves filed a report with the State Health Board describing an individual brought to his office by 2 federal agents for what was described as a routine examination. He filed the report because the individual's dimensions required him to use measuring equipment he did not have, and he wanted the discrepancy on record. The State Health Board acknowledged receipt of the report in a letter. The report itself is not in the State Health Board archive. The acknowledgement letter is: Ohio County, West Virginia, 1882. A freight company ledger from the Wheeling and Elm Grove Railroad records a cargo shipment in March of that year described as agricultural equipment, oversized, federal consignment, destination withheld per shipper instruction. The weight listed for the shipment was 2,200 pounds. Agricultural equipment of that weight shipped under federal instruction to an undisclosed destination in the same county, in the same year, as the established location of the transfer of the Moundsville occupant. The freight ledger is in the Ohio County Public Library's historical collection. It has not been cited in any published history of the period. Mason County, West Virginia, 1884. A schoolteacher named Hortense Crail wrote in a letter to her sister, a letter preserved in a family collection and donated to a local historical society in 1962, that she had seen, from a distance of approximately 40 yards, a figure walking in an enclosed yard behind a structure on the old federal agricultural parcel east of Point Pleasant. She wrote that she had stopped her buggy and looked for a long moment because she could not immediately account for what she was seeing. She wrote that she had eventually accounted for it by deciding she was mistaken about the distance, which was the only explanation that allowed her to continue driving home without stopping entirely. She wrote that she had thought about the distance many times since, and that she was no longer certain she had been mistaken about it. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern, and the institutional response to that pattern was not passive containment. The Bureau of Ethnology's budget allocations for the period 1882 through 1887, buried in the line items of the Interior Department's annual reports to Congress, show a recurring and increasing expenditure under the Western Survey Continuance heading that has no corresponding published output. No surveys published, no reports filed, no findings presented. 6 years of increasing federal expenditure producing, officially, nothing at all. The economics make no sense unless the expenditure was producing something that was never intended to be presented publicly. Something that required a facility, a physician, a warden, and the kind of institutional silence that costs money to maintain. But here is what makes Solomon Vetch's account different from every other suppressed record in this chain. In his letter to Porter Gaines, written in 1892, 1 year before his death and 11 years after the occupant first arrived at the facility, Vetch described the end. The occupant had died in the spring of 1887, 6 years after his arrival. Vetch had been present. The physician Sohn had been present. No one else. Vetch wrote that the death had not been sudden and had not been entirely unexpected, and that in the weeks preceding it, the occupant had spoken more than he had spoken in the preceding year combined. That he had seemed, in Vetch's assessment, to be working through a list, addressing things in a deliberate order, as though the long patience had a final protocol and he was executing it. On the last night, Vetch wrote, the occupant had asked him to come close. This was unusual. In 6 years, the occupant had never asked for physical proximity. Vetch had come close, and the occupant had spoken to him at a volume that Vetch described as barely above breath. Not because he lacked the strength, Vetch was careful to note, but because what he was saying was not for the room. Vetch wrote that he had listened for approximately 4 minutes. He wrote that he had understood, while listening, why the 11 notebooks were necessary. He wrote that he could not put what he had heard into the letter to Gaines because the letter might not reach Gaines intact, and because some portion of what had been said to him was not his to give away in correspondence. That it had been given to him specifically for reasons the occupant had explained, and that he had recorded it as faithfully as he could in the notebooks, and that the notebooks were as complete an account as he was capable of producing, and that he hoped, sincerely, that someone would eventually find a way to read them. He wrote one thing the occupant had said that he was willing to commit to a letter. The occupant had said, "They will keep taking and sealing and burying, and the record they make would be the record that stands, unless someone on your side decides that it shouldn't." And then he had looked at Vetch with an expression that Vetch described, in the last line before the letter's closing, as the expression of a man who has placed something valuable into hands he has judged the best available option rather than the ideal one, and had made his peace with the difference. Solomon Vetch is buried in the Oddfellows Cemetery in Parkersburg, West Virginia. His grave marker gives his name and his military rank and the years 1831 to 1893. Nothing else. The facility he described has not been identified. The federal land records for the candidate counties, Mason, Jackson, Wirt, Roane, show transfers and reclassifications in the relevant period that are consistent with the disposal of a facility whose existence was never formally acknowledged. Consistent with, but not confirming. Because a facility that was never formally acknowledged cannot be formally decommissioned, and so what you find instead are the edges of it. Land that changed hands at the wrong price, structures that were removed without permits, access roads that appear in one survey and not the next. Walter Soane's 7 volumes of case notes remain missing. The 11 composition notebooks of Solomon Vetch remain missing. The 44-page deposition of Cornelius Hatch remains missing. The pages of Minister Fenn's journal covering Prudence Calloway's account remain cut out and gone. What remains is the freight ledger in the Ohio County Library, the single loose page in the Soane papers in Philadelphia, the letter to Porter Gaines in a private collection in western Pennsylvania, Hortense Crail's letter to her sister in a local historical society, August Renner's lecture transcript in Carnegie Library, Justice Wicks's diary at West Virginia University, Francis Pruitt's 1931 account, the 3 words on a headstone in Walton, and a pattern of removal so consistent, so specific, and so expensive to maintain across so many counties and so many decades, that the removal itself is the most compelling document of all. Because you do not spend that kind of institutional energy making nothing disappear. The official record tells us that the giant mound builders are mythology, that the bones were misidentified, that the accounts were exaggerated, and that the Bureau of Ethnology's work in the Ohio Valley was a model of transparent scientific inquiry. What the freight ledgers, the cut journal pages, the missing case notes, the thin personnel file, the wrong-priced land transfers, and a dying man's letter to an old army friend tell us is that the official record was not the conclusion of an investigation. It was the goal of one. These stories survive because Solomon Vetch wrote 11 notebooks in a rented room above a hardware store and asked a landlady to keep them safe. Because Prudence Calloway said enough to a minister to leave a thread. Because Cornelius Hatch kept a ledger with measurements no forger would think to invent. Because people like you understand that the distance between what institutions say and what institutions do is not a gap in the record. It is the record. History doesn't disappear when it's buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Next week, I'm pulling the thread that leads to Washington, to a federal warehouse on the edge of the Capitol that processed what one surviving internal memo calls survey acquisitions not suitable for standard cataloging. One building, one memo, one inventory column with entries that stop without explanation in the spring of 1887. The same spring, Solomon Vetch sat beside a bed in an unnamed facility and listened for 4 minutes to something he spent the rest of his life trying to find the right words for. You won't want to miss it.